Hi friends, welcome to Sunday School. I'm Pastor Carrie and I'm really glad that once again we get to be together to think about our story. Our story this week from the story is out of Egypt, the story of Moses. And Moses is another one of those examples in the Bible of someone we can look to for good directions, for as an example of someone who is faithful to God, who receives God's love, is changed by God's love, and responds to God's love. We've been talking all this time about a wonderful verse in the book of Jeremiah, where we are asked to stand and look for the ancient paths, the paths that are good, that are a good way, and paths that lead to rest for our souls. And Moses is one of those characters. Moses is a person that we can look to for good directions, to find those ancient paths, the paths that lead to us being faithful to God. So let's get out our story card. Moses, let's look at our key verse for this chapter, chapter 4 of the story. Moses answered the people. He said, "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Stand firm. You will see how the Lord will save you today." Exodus 14:13. That's a really comforting verse. Don't be afraid. Stand firm, and today you will see how the Lord will save you. Yeah, that's a great encouragement. It's an encouragement to me. I hope it's an encouragement to you. Let's learn a little bit about Moses. Moses was born Hebrew, but because of all sorts of circumstances that you read in the story, he was raised in an Egyptian palace as an Egyptian prince. He fled Egypt, and then while he was roaming around in the desert, he was chosen to lead the Israelite slaves out of Egypt. Yeah, God chose him, and God had a plan. And then in the end, actually, I think next week in chapter 5, we will read about how God gave the 10 commandments, or the 10 best ways to live, to Moses. So we're going to continue Moses' story next week. So as we've been journeying through the story, looking to these examples of people who were faithful, looking to these folks who were examples, who are examples to us of faithfulness to God, walking those ancient paths, the good way, the way that leads to rest for the soul. We've been asking ourselves two ancient questions. Who is God? Who is God? Because, you know, the picture in our mind of who God is so important. Think about that for a minute. The picture, the image of who God is that's in our minds is so important. And we want to make sure that we have an image that really represents who God is, right? Because we know God is love, but there are so many ways to think about God's love, to experience God's love, to be changed by God's love. So we want that picture to be very full, very as whole as we can make it. And so we're constantly seeking and digging deeper into who God is. So first question, who is God? And then what does God want me to do? What's God calling us to do? So let's start by a little bit of a review. Who is God? Who is God? Let's answer that very simply, all right? God is great. Yeah, who is God? God is great. Let's review the stories that we've studied so far. God has a great imagination. Yeah, a great imagination. We see that in the story of creation. God offers us great do-overs. Yeah, we talked about, you know, as people who follow God, we know we need do-overs sometimes. When we don't do the following part so well, we sometimes need a do-over. We see that in the story of Noah. God provides great do-overs, great imagination, great do-overs. In the story of Abraham, we see God has great plans for us, great plans, and those great plans are built on great promises. Yeah, we see that through the story of Abraham. And then last week in the story of Joseph, we see that to bring about these great plans in our life, that God provides opportunities for great transformation or great changes, changes in thinking, changes in behavior, changes in our speech and what we say. God provides great changes. And in this chapter, chapter 5, we see God's great power. We see God's great power in the story of Moses. Great power that's based on great love. It's not based on anger or greed or some of the other things that sometimes fuel power. Sometimes great fear is what fuels power. But what is so great about God's great power is that it comes from great love. Friends, we are so loved by God. Moses was so loved by God. That great power that we see in Moses' life, the great power of God that we see in Moses' life, provided great protection. We see that him being protected in that basket with his sister Miriam looking on as another form of protection. We see great protection. We see a great sending, right? We see this great and mysteriously wonderful story of Moses hearing God's voice in a bush that's on fire but not burning up. We hear this great sending. And then we have a great leading. God's great power and great love makes Moses able to do to lead, to provide this great leading of God's people out of slavery and through the Red Sea to the other side, to safety. And so again, we see great protection, just like we saw great protection at the beginning of the story with the basket in the Nile River and Miriam and the princess coming to bathe and to finding Moses. We see another great protection at the end where all of God's people get through on dry ground through the Red Sea, and they all get to the other side. And that process protects the people from the Egyptian army that was chasing them. So much greatness. Who is God? God is great. God has a great imagination. God provides us great do-overs. God has great plans for us based on great promises. God gives us opportunity for great change, for great transformation, from doing things our way to doing things God's way, that of course lead to those that peace and rest for our souls. And then God does all this through God's great power to protect, power to send, power to help us lead, power that comes from a great love. We see in the story of Moses and the great power displayed in this story, we see that God is always with us, and we see that God is always for us. Our text today in the story says that God is always fighting for us. God is on our side, protecting us, sending us, leading us. God wants to be so involved in our life. That's another thing that God does in a great, great way. So let's wrap it up. What does God want from us? We've established how great God is. What does God require of us? Well, I have one of my alphabet plaques here. God wants our yes. And we all know that that big Y means yes. That's what God wants from us. That's what Moses gave God. Even though Moses wasn't quite sure about his own power, he had a lot of questions about his own power, didn't he? His own power to speak well, to approach Pharaoh and ask for the release of God's people. So he had some questions about his own power. But he had seen God's faithfulness and he had experienced God's faithfulness, and that allowed him to say yes to God's great power. That God's great power, based on great love, would work through him. So who is God? God is great. What is God asking of us? God is asking us to say yes. Yes to God's power working through us, providing protection, providing a good word that sends people out to do God's work, to fulfill God's plans. God is asking us to say yes to leading wherever God would need us to lead, wherever God sends us. So let's say yes this week, friends, even when it's difficult. It was difficult for Moses. Even when we struggle, when we stop and we think, ooh, I don't know if I have enough power, enough strength, enough imagination to make that happen. Whatever it is, God's power in us can provide all that is needed. Provide all that is needed for God's great promises to come true, for God's great plans to be fulfilled. All right, friends, I hope you're encouraged by that. I hope you are encouraged that God is with you and for you and working for our good, working out all these things for our good. All right, friends, you are loved. I pray that you are filled with the peace of Christ. All right, bye-bye.